Alright, so we're back once again today, and today we're going to be doing something a little bit different. Now, if you've watched my Warspite video before, it's more of a history focused video, and today's video is going to be very similar to that. Except, instead of focusing on the Warspite, we're going to be focusing on the Bismarck. Basically, the German capital ship built during World War II. So with that being said, let's actually get into it. So the Bismarck class battleships consisted of two battleships that were built just before the outbreak of the Second World War. One being obviously the Bismarck, and the other being the Tirpitz. The Tirpitz had a relatively quiet life, even though it existed throughout the exact same period as the Bismarck, which in contrast had an extremely lively life, from trying to escape to the Atlantic, to being tailed by the Royal Navy, being attacked several times, and also seemingly being completely resistant to sinking. The Bismarck was named after Otto von Bismarck, the German leader who effectively caused the unification of Germany in 1871. Alongside this, he also was the very first Chancellor of Germany, serving in the role from around 1871 to 1890. Bismarck was designed in the mid-1930s. During this time, there was a lot of militarization happening all over Europe, not kind of unlike the one leading up to the First World War. As a result, the Bismarck was an answer to French naval expansion that was occurring around 1935, specifically the two Richelieu class battleships that were being built at the time. The Bismarck and her sister ship the Tirpitz were laid down after the signing of the Anglo-German Naval Agreement in 1935. The treaty basically stated that the total tonnage allowed by the Kriegsmarine could not exceed 35% of the total tonnage of the Royal Navy on a permanent basis. Congruently, the Bismarck was nominally within the 36,000 ton limit imposed by the Washington regime. This regime governed naval ship construction during the interwar period, which lasted from 1918 to about 1939. However, in reality, Bismarck exceeded this figure by a wide margin. But, as luck would have it, by the time the Bismarck was completed, these agreements had basically fallen apart, especially with Japan's withdrawal from major international agreements in 1937. This allowed for an expansion in tonnage within the scope of the former agreements that meant that the Bismarck was no longer in violation of the previous treaties. Fully loaded, the Bismarck displaced about 50,300 tons, with a length of 251 metres, a beam of about 36 metres, and a maximum draft of about 9.9 metres. The Bismarck was the biggest warship in the Kriegsmarine at the time, and displaced more than any other European battleship of that time. The Bismarck was powered by 3 Blohm and Voss geared steam turbines and 12 oil-fired Wagner superheated boilers, which meant that the Bismarck could effectively reach a blistering 30 knots. The Bismarck had a range of about 9,000 nautical miles, or about 16,500 kilometres, at a cruising speed of 19 knots. Being a new battleship at the time also meant that the Bismarck was fitted with 3 Fumo 23 search radar sets, mounted both on the forward and stern rangefinders and the crew nest. In terms of crew, they consisted of 103 officers and 1,962 enlisted men. The crew was further divided into 12 divisions of around 180 to 220 men. The first 6 divisions being assigned to the ship's armament, the 7th division consisting of specialists like cooks and carpenters, the 8th division was ammunition handlers, the 9th being operators, signalmen and quartermasters, with the remaining 3 divisions being engine personnel. When Bismarck finally did leave port, its crew had swollen to around 2,200 men. That's when you include things such as war correspondents and prize crews for ships they capture, stuff like that. In terms of armament, the Bismarck had 8 15-inch SK C-34 guns, arranged in a 4x2 configuration, with 2 forward firing turrets called Anton and Bruno, and the aft firing turrets being known as Caesar and Dora. In terms of secondaries, these consisted of 5.9-inch L-55 guns, 16 4.1-inch L-65 guns, and 16 1.5-inch L-83 guns, and finally 12 0.79-inch or 2 cm anti-aircraft guns. The Bismarck also carried 4 float planes and a single hangar for all 4 aircraft, and a double-ended catapult. Finally, in terms of armour, the main belt for the Bismarck was 320mm or 12.6 inches thick, and was covered by a pair of upper and main armour decks that were 50mm or 2 inches and 100mm to 120mm thick respectively. The 15-inch turrets were protected by 360mm or 14.2 inch thick faces and 220mm or 8.7 inch thick sides. The ship was launched on the 14th of February 1939 and was christened by Dorothy von Lauenfeld, the granddaughter of Otto von Bismarck. Speeches were also made by Adolf Hitler at the time. With the construction of the Bismarck completed and it launched, its operational history had now begun, and it started with Operation Reinabang on the 19th of May 1941. On the 5th of May 1941, Hitler arrived to view both the Bismarck and the Tirpitz in Gottenhafen, where both ships were situated at the time. Hitler met with Gunther Luckiest, the Bismarck's commander, to discuss the upcoming mission. As a result of Luckiest's insistence that both the Bismarck and the Prince Eugene were ready for operations, the go-ahead was given on the 19th of May to begin Operation Reinabang. At 2 AM on the 19th of May, Bismarck departed Gottenhaben and made for the Danish Straits. The Prince Eugene joined her at 11:25 AM. The Prince Eugene had departed the previous evening off Cape Arcona. Both ships were accompanied by 3 destroyers, Z-10, Z-16 and Z-23. The Luftwaffe also provided limited aerial cover for the flotilla. Around this time, a group of 10 or 12 Swedish aircraft flying reconnaissance found the German flotilla and reported its positioning and heading, although the Germans had no idea that they had been seen. Already being detected, things only went from bad to worse for the Germans. As soon as they were spotted, they encountered the Swedish cruiser Gotland, which began shadowing the German flotilla for 2 hours in the Kattegat. Gotland gave a report to naval headquarters stating 2 large ships, 3 destroyers, 5 escort vessels, and 10 to 12 aircraft passed Marstrand. Although the Oberkommander der Marine was not worried about the Swedish cruiser, Luckiest believed that operational secrecy had been lost, and he wasn't wrong. The report made its way to Captain Henry Denham, the British naval attaché to Sweden, who gave the information to the Admiralty. The code breakers at Bletchley Park confirmed that a raid was imminent in the Atlantic, as they had decrypted reports that Bismarck and Prince Eugene had taken on prize crew and additional navigational charts from headquarters. A pair of submarine Spitfires were ordered to search the Norwegian coast in an attempt to spot the flotilla. In a similar vein, however, German aerial reconnaissance confirmed that 1 aircraft carrier, 3 battleships and 4 cruisers remained at anchor in Scapa Flow. This confirmed to Luckiest that the British were unaware of this operation. Finally, on the evening of the 20th of May, the Bismarck finally reached the Norwegian coast. The following morning, the Prince Eugene picked up a radio transmission that ordered British reconnaissance aircraft to search for the 2 battleships and 3 destroyers off the Norwegian coast. Shortly after 12 AM, the flotilla reached Bergen and anchored at Grimstadfjord. The ships were repainted from the Baltic camouflage to the standard outboard grey, used by German ships that were operating in the Atlantic at the time. While the Bismarck was in Norway, a pair of Bf-109 fighters circled overhead to protect the flotilla from aerial attack. However, despite their best efforts, Flying Officer Michael Suckling managed to fly his Spitfire directly over the German ships, and even managed to take photos of Bismarck and her escorts. As soon as this information was given to Admiral John Tovey, he ordered the HMS Hood and the HMS Prince of Wales alongside 6 destroyers to reinforce the pair of cruisers patrolling the Danish Strait. 7:38 PM on the 21st of May, Bismarck, Prince Eugene and the 3 escorting destroyers left their base at Bergen. At midnight, when the flotilla was in the open sea, heading towards the Arctic Ocean, Hitler was informed of the operation and very reluctantly agreed to the raid. Eventually, the 3 escorting destroyers left the flotilla at 4:15 in the morning on the 22nd of May. At 12 AM, Luckiest ordered both ships to turn toward the Denmark Strait in an attempt to break out into the open Atlantic. By 4 AM on the 23rd, Luckiest ordered Bismarck and the Prince Eugene to increase their speed to 27 knots in order to make the dash through the Denmark Strait and into the Atlantic. 2 hours later, both ships had reached a point just north of Iceland, where the ships were forced to dodge to avoid ice floes. At 7:22, the HMS Suffolk was spotted at a range of 12.5 kilometers. Prince Eugene's radio intercept team decrypted the radio signals being sent by Suffolk and learned that their location had been reported. Luckiest gave permission for Prince Eugene to engage the Suffolk, but the visibility was terrible, and the German captain could not make out his target, so he held fire. As a result, the Suffolk retreated to a safe distance and continued to shadow both ships. At 8:30, the heavy cruiser HMS Norfolk joined the Suffolk, but got too close to the German ships, and as a result, Luckiest ordered the attack on the British cruiser. Bismarck fired 5 salvos, 3 of which very narrowly missed the Norfolk on either side, and rained shell splinters on the decks of the British cruiser. The Norfolk quickly fled into a fog bank, which ended the brief engagement. As a result of firing her 38cm guns, the Bismarck's Fumo 23 radar was knocked out. As a result, the Prince Eugene took the lead so that she could use her radar to scout for the information. Not much else happened that night. Both cruisers continued to remain on station throughout the night, continued relaying the location and bearing of both ships. At 5:07 in the morning, the Prince Eugene detected a pair of unidentified vessels approaching the German formation at a range of 20 nautical miles, reporting noise of 2 fast-moving turbine ships at 280 relative bearing. The Royal Navy was coming. At 6:15 on the 24th of May, German lookouts spotted smoke on the horizon. It was the Royal Navy. More specifically, it was the HMS Hood and the HMS Prince of Wales, under the command of Vice Admiral Lancelot Holland. Luckiest ordered his ships cruise to battle stations. At 6:08, the range had fallen to 26 kilometers, and the Hood opened fire, quickly followed by the Prince of Wales a minute later. There was, however, a bit of confusion. The Hood engaged the Prince Eugene, believing it was the Bismarck, while the Prince of Wales fired on the Bismarck. Eventually, Luckiest allowed his ships to fire back, and at 5:06 ordered his ships to engage the British. Initially, the British ships approached the Bismarck and Prince Eugene head-on, which meant they could only fire their 2 forward turrets, while the German ships being positioned broadside could fire 4 turrets. Several minutes after opening fire, Holland, the British commander, ordered to turn 20 degrees to port in order to return full broadsides. As a result, both German ships now concentrated on the HMS Hood. A single minute after opening fire, Prince Eugene scored a direct hit with a high explosive shell, setting a light, unrotated projectile ammunition and started a large fire, but it was quickly put out. Eventually, Schneider, first gunnery officer, had found the range to the Hood. He immediately ordered rapid-fire salvos from Bismarck's guns, concurrently ordering the 15cm secondary guns to fire on the Prince of Wales. Holland then ordered another 20-degree turn to port, which brought the British ships in a parallel course with the German battleships. Luckiest ordered Prince Eugene to shift fire to target the Prince of Wales in order to keep both ships under fire at once. At 6 AM, Hood was completing the second turn to port when Bismarck's fifth salvo hit. Two of the shells landed short, striking the water close to the ship, but at least one of the 38cm armour-piercing shells struck Hood and penetrated her thin deck armour. The shell reached Hood's rear ammunition magazine and detonated 112 tons of cordite propellant, and the result, as you'd expect, was pretty devastating. The resulting explosion broke the back of the ship between the main mast and the rear funnel. The forward section even continued to move forward briefly before the inrushing water caused the bow to rise into the air at a steep angle. Similarly, the stem also rose as water rushed into the now exposed compartments. In only 8 minutes of firing, HMS Hood had disappeared, taking all but 3 of her 1,419 crew with her. The Bismarck then shifted fire to the Prince of Wales. The British battleship scored a hit on the Bismarck with their 6th salvo, but the German battleship found her mark with her very first salvo. One of the fire shells struck the bridge of the Prince of Wales, although it did not explode within the ship, instead going straight through the ship. But as it did, it killed everyone in the ship's command centre, with the exception being the ship's captain, John Leach, and one other. Both of the German ships continued to fire on the Prince of Wales, resulting in heavy damage for the British ship. Despite having difficulty with their guns, the Prince of Wales managed to score 3 hits on the Bismarck, the first of which struck her forecastle, just at a height where sea waves were capable of entering the ship. The second struck just below her armour belt and exploded on contact with the torpedo bulkhead, completely flooding a turbo generator room and partially flooding a boiler room. The third shell passed through one of the boats carried aboard the ship and went through the float plane catapult without exploding. At 13 minutes past 6, Leach gave the order to retreat. Only 5 of his ship's 10 guns, or 10 14-inch guns, were still firing, and the ship had sustained serious amount of damage. The ship made a 160-degree turn and set a smokescreen to cover her withdrawal. The Germans ceased fire as the range widened. Although Lindemann strongly advocated chasing the Prince of Wales and destroying it, Luckiest obeyed operational orders to shun any avoidable engagement with enemy forces that were not protecting a convoy, instead ordering both ships to head for the North Atlantic. In the engagement, Bismarck had fired 93 armour-piercing shells and had only been hit by 3 shells in return. After the engagement, Luckiest reported battlecruiser, probably Hood, sunk. Another battleship, King George V or Renoan, turned away damaged. 2 heavy cruisers maintained contact. Not soon after this, Prime Minister Winston Churchill ordered all warships in the area to join the pursuit of the Bismarck and the Prince Eugene. In all, 6 battleships and battlecruisers, 2 aircraft carriers, 13 cruisers, 21 destroyers were committed to the chase. By around 5 PM, the crew aboard the Prince of Wales restored 9 of her 10 main guns to working order, which meant that she was put at the head of the formation to attack the Bismarck if the opportunity arose. The Prince Eugene was successfully detached from the Bismarck at 14 minutes past 6. Bismarck turned around to face the head of the approaching formation, spearheaded by the Prince of Wales. This forced the Suffolk to turn away at a high speed. Prince of Wales fired 12 salvos at the Bismarck, which responded with 9 salvos itself, none of which hit. This action distracted the British ships just long enough for the Prince Eugene to slip away. After the Bismarck returned to her previous heading, 3 ships took up station on the Bismarck's port side. Although the Bismarck had been damaged, she was still capable of achieving 27 or 28 knots. This was the top speed of the King George V. Unless the Bismarck could be slowed, it seemed likely that the German ship would reach St. Nazaire for repairs. At 10 PM, HMS Victorious launched an airstrike consisting of 6 Fairey Fulmar fighters and 9 Fairey Swordfish torpedo bombers of 825 Naval Air Squadron. In what could only be described as an embarrassing mistake, the inexperienced aviators nearly attacked the HMS Norfolk and the US Coast Guard on their approach. This confusion meant that the Bismarck's anti-aircraft guns were now at full alert. Bismarck also used her main and secondary batteries to fire at maximum depression to create giant splashes in the path of the incoming torpedo bombers. None of the attacking aircraft were shot down. Bismarck evaded 8 of the torpedoes launched at her, but the 9th struck admiral ships on the main armour belt, throwing 1 man into the bulkhead and killing him and injuring 5 others. The ship suffered serious damage as a result of the manoeuvres to evade the incoming torpedoes, which caused more flooding through the hole caused by the earlier shell impact in the front of the ship. This caused the complete abandonment of the port number 2 boiler room. The loss of a second boiler forced the ship to slow to 16 knots. Divers repaired the collision mats in the bow. This allowed the ship's speed to increase to 20 knots. This was the speed that was most efficient in order to reach occupied France at the time. At 3 AM on the 25th of May, Luckiest ordered an increase to maximum speed, which at this point was 28 knots. He then ordered the ship to circle away to the west and then north. This manoeuvre coincided with the period during which the Bismarck was out of radar range. Bismarck successfully broke radar contact and circled back behind her pursuers. Suffolk's captain assumed that the Bismarck had broken off to the west and attempted to find her by also steaming west. However, the Bismarck was unaware that she had broken radar contact and continued to send long radio messages to Naval Group West headquarters in Paris. These messages were intercepted by the British, from which the bearings were determined. They were then wrongly plotted on board King George V, leading the British ships to sail 7 hours in the wrong direction. By the time the mistake was discovered, the Bismarck had created significant distance between itself and the pursuing ships. A squadron of Coastal Command PBY Catalinas, based in Northern Ireland, joined the search, covering areas where the Bismarck might head in an attempt to reach occupied France. At 10:30 AM on the 26th of May, a Catalina pilot of the US Navy located her, some 690 miles northwest of Brest. At the Bismarck's current speed, she would be close enough to reach the protection of U-boats and the Luftwaffe in less than a day. Most British forces were not close enough to stop her. The only opportunity that the Royal Navy had to stop the Bismarck was the HMS Ark Royal with Force H. Ark Royal swordfish were already searching nearby when the Catalina found the Bismarck. Several torpedo bombers also located the battleship, about 60 nautical miles away from the Ark Royal. An attack was ordered as soon as the swordfish had returned and been armed with torpedoes. In another cruel blunder, the cruiser HMS Sheffield was attached to shadow the Bismarck, but the swordfish pilots were not informed of this. As a result, the swordfish attacked the Sheffield, but luckily failed to do any damage, as the detonators on their torpedoes failed to function. The bombers were reloaded with new detonators and once again set out to attack the Bismarck. The attack comprised 15 aircraft and was launched at 7:10 in the evening. At 13 minutes to 9, the torpedo bombers began their attack descent through the clouds. As the swordfish attacked, the Bismarck turned violently as her anti-aircraft guns engaged the bombers. One torpedo hit amidships on the port side, just below the bottom edge of the main armour belt. The force of the explosion was mainly contained by the underwater protection system and the belt armour, but some structural damage was caused by minor flooding. However, the second torpedo was much more devastating and basically sealed the Bismarck's fate. It hit the stern on the port side, near the port rudder shaft. As a result from this impact, the coupling on the port rudder assembly was badly damaged, and the rudder became locked in a 12-degree turn to port. The explosion also caused much shock damage. The crew did manage to repair the starboard rudder, but the port rudder remained jammed. A suggestion to sever the port rudder with explosive was dismissed by Luckiest, as damage to the screws could have left the battleship helpless. At 9:15 in the evening, Luckiest reported that the ship was unmaneuverable. With the port rudder jammed, Bismarck was now steaming in a large circle, unable to escape the incoming enemy forces. Luckiest signalled the headquarters at 20 minutes to 10 on the 26th of May. Ship unmaneuverable. We will fight to the last shell. Long live the Führer. The mood of the crew became increasingly depressed, especially as messages from the naval command reached the ship. As darkness fell, the Bismarck briefly fired on the Sheffield, though the cruiser quickly fled. Sheffield lost contact in low visibility, therefore 5 destroyers were ordered to keep contact with the Bismarck throughout the night. The ships encountered the Bismarck at 38 minutes past 10. The battleship quickly engaged them with her main battery. After firing 3 salvos, she straddled the Polish destroyer ORP Pyron. The destroyer continued to close the range until a near miss at around 12 kilometers forced her to turn away. The 5 destroyers harried Bismarck, illuminated her with star shells and firing dozens of torpedoes, none of which hit. After daybreak on the 27th of May, King George V led the attack. The home fleet intended to steam directly at Bismarck until he was about 8 nautical miles away. At that point they would turn south to put his ships parallel to the target. At 17 minutes to 9 in the morning, lookouts on the King George V spotted her, some 23 kilometers away. 4 minutes later, King George V's 14-inch guns began firing. Bismarck returned fire at 10 to 9 with her forward guns. Bismarck's ability to aim her guns deteriorated as the ship, unable to steer, moved erratically in the heavy seas and deprived Schneider of a predictable course for range calculations. As the range fell, the ship's secondary batteries joined the battle. HMS Norfolk and HMS Dorsetshire closed and began firing with their 8-inch guns. At 2 minutes past 9, a 16-inch shell from HMS Rodney struck Bismarck's forward superstructure, killing hundreds of men and severely damaging the 2 forward turrets. According to survivors, this salvo probably killed both Lindemann and Luckiest and the rest of the bridge staff. The main fire control director was also destroyed by this hit. A second shell from the salvo struck the forward main battery, which was disabled, though it would manage to fire one last salvo at 27 minutes past 9. The Lieutenant von Mullenheim-Rechberg in the rear control station took over firing control for the rear turrets. He managed to fire 3 salvos before a shell destroyed the gun director, disabling his equipment. He gave the order for the guns to fire independently. But 31 minutes past 9, all 4 main battery guns had been put out of action. One of the Bismarck's shells exploded 20 feet off Rodney's bow and damaged her starboard torpedo tube. This was the closest the Bismarck came to a direct hit on her opponents. By 10 AM, 2 battleships had fired over 700 main battery shells, many at very close range. Bismarck had been reduced to nothing, on fire from stem to stern. She was also slowly settling by the stern from uncontrolled flooding with a 20-degree list to port. Rodney close to 2.7 kilometers, point-blank range for guns of that size, and continued to fire. The British could not cease fire until the Germans struck their ensigns, or it became clear that they were abandoning ship. Rodney fired 2 torpedoes from her port side tube and claimed 1 hit, this being the only time in history where one battleship had successfully torpedoed another battleship. First Officer Hans Olds ordered the men below the decks to abandon ship. He instructed the engine room crews to open the ship's watertight doors and prepared scuttling charges. Gerhard Unack, the chief engineering officer, ordered his men to set the demolition charges with a 9-minute fuse. Unack and his comrades heard the demolition charges detonated as they made their way up through the various levels. Olds rushed through the ship, ordering men to abandon their posts. After he reached the deck, a huge explosion killed him and about 100 others. The 4 British ships fired more than 2,800 shells at the Bismarck and scored more than 400 hits, but were unable to sink the Bismarck by gunfire. At around 20 minutes past 10, running low on fuel, Dove ordered the cruiser Dorsetshire to sink Bismarck with torpedoes and sent his battleships back to port. At 35 minutes past 10, Bismarck capsized to port and slowly sank by the stern, disappearing from the surface by 10:40. Unack, who had abandoned the ship by the time it capsized, observed no underwater damage to the ship's starboard side. Von Mullenham-Richburg reported the same, but assumed that the port side, which was then underwater, had been more significantly damaged. Dorsetshire and destroyer Maori moved in and lowered ropes to pull the survivors aboard. Dorsetshire had rescued 85 men, and Maori had picked up 25 men by the time they left the scene. A U-boat later reached the survivors and found 3 men, and a German trawler rescued another 2. One of the men picked up by the British died of his wounds the following day. Out of a crew of 2,200 men, only 114 survived. And that pretty much sums up the story of the Bismarck. Out of the entirety of the Bismarck's life, probably the most defining moment was the destruction of the hood, and it's probably still talked about so much to this very day. But in doing so, and causing the destruction of the hood, it caused the entire force of the Royal Navy to be brought down to bear on the German capital ship. In my mind, the thought always persists is, what did the Germans hope to achieve through these raids with the Bismarck? It seemed like a lot to lose for very little gain. Fundamentally, is risking a capital ship worth it for a few raids? You know, a role pretty much already perfect and already being operated by U-boats? One decision that plays in my mind is that Lukens never blew that rear rudder when the ship was basically unmaneuverable anyways. Seems as though he had given up before trying everything, but that's what ifs, and they have to stay in the past. I hope you enjoyed this short history of the Bismarck, and I'll see you in the next one.